Protective Services. Anybody that needs to take a 7th inning stretch? It's only the 2nd inning, but go ahead and stretch. Oh boy. Okay, go ahead and state your name and who you represent for the record, and let's go. Okay.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. My name is Amy Tripp, and I'm the project manager for the Sunset Review of the Department of Family and Protective Services, or DFPS. DFPS aims to protect children, adults 65 and older, and individuals with disabilities from abuse and neglect by investigating allegations and providing services, as well as by regulating child care providers. The agency has nearly 11,000 staff in every part of the state and about $1.4 billion in annual expenditures. Child Protective Services, or CPS, is far and away the agency's most visible function and its largest program, accounting for about 85% of overall expenditures. This agency has an important and challenging mission. CPS caseworkers, many of them young and recently out of training, must balance the often competing pressures of protecting children while respecting the rights of parents and keeping families together. Despite the difficulty of its mission, the agency must answer for every bad outcome. As a result, DFPS is an agency that frequently finds itself on the defensive and reacting to crisis and criticism, which has created an ongoing cycle of both legislative and self-imposed change. Given the unique nature of this agency and its history of constant transition, the central theme of the Sunset Review was instead to make recommendations that would help the agency better focus on and improve the most basic day-to-day aspects of managing its challenging work. Allow me to highlight some of the key issues in the staff report and then answer any questions you have about those or any of the others. I'll start with issue 1, which addresses CPS caseworker turnover, which is a perennial area of legislative concern and interest because it directly impacts the agency's ability to fulfill its mission of protecting children. We found that historically DFPS has focused primarily on hiring and training large numbers of new workers, but has not adequately addressed internal management issues that cause many caseworkers to leave the agency quickly thereafter. Our review found that DFPS simply has not done enough to shape a work culture that supports and develops caseworkers to successfully address turnover. While increasing caseworker pay may seem like an obvious answer to alleviating turnover, our recommendations instead focus on correcting poor management practices within DFPS's direct control that contribute to turnover, such as punitive use of corrective actions by management and a lack of critical on-the-job training for new staff. Some of the recommendations in issue 1 include directing the agency to dedicate certain CPS caseworker positions as mentors to better support new staff. We also recommend strengthening the agency's workforce support functions, such as addressing internal complaints and proactively identifying areas of the state with especially high turnover rates. We also recommend using turnover as a tool in evaluating CPS management performance and making the agency's way of evaluating caseworker performance more fair. Next, issue 2 makes a broader assessment of CPS management and highlights its crisis culture, which has distracted the agency from developing an effective management approach and ensuring it delivers desired results. In fact, DFPS has a history of identifying some of the same management issues but not adequately addressing them. Current agency management has recognized the need to take a step back and reevaluate the most basic aspects of the way CPS operates through a contracted operational assessment. Representatives from the contractor who performed the assessment, the Stephen Group, are here today and will present their recently released report and recommendations following my testimony. Sunset staff recommendations in issue 2 are intended to help the agency take a time out and focus on improving the most basic aspects of CPS operations. The recommendations aim to complement the contracted assessment and include improved planning, policy making, and implementation, and strengthened state-level oversight of CPS regional operations. In addition, one of the recommendations provides DFPS the unique opportunity to propose statutory changes to the Sunset Commission in October 2014 that would help the agency implement recommendations resulting from the operational assessment and focus its efforts more squarely on its child protection mission. Next, in issue 3, we address foster care redesign, which is DFPS's attempt to reform the state's foster care system, which has well-known and long-standing problems. We found that currently very little experience or data exists to judge the performance of the foster care redesign model the agency's developed to inform decisions about future implementation, and that foster care redesign has inherent risks that justify a cautious approach to further rollout across the state. Sunset staff recommendations include directing the agency to evaluate performance data and costs prior to broader implementation of foster care redesign, developing a long-term implementation plan informed by this evaluation, and more comprehensively and consistently monitoring and reporting on the performance of the overall foster care system. More briefly, in Issue 4, we recommend a stronger, more consistent approach to enforcement by DFPS's Child Care Licensing Division to better ensure the safety of children in regulated care, including foster care. In Issue 5, we make recommendations to ensure DFPS captures a broader spectrum of data to accurately assess the risk to children in CPS cases, as well as evaluate the quality of the services it provides to families. In Issue 6, we recommend the agency better target its prevention efforts and more effectively use data to evaluate and report performance and program outcomes. That concludes my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. And it's interesting that, you know, your issue number 1 is related to turnover, because I really believe that if we don't address that problem, you know, all these others fall by the wayside. I mean, we've got to address that problem, and I'm very happy to see the attention that you focused on that in your report. We hear often that to resolve the problems that we faced in CPS, and we keep rehashing and rehashing, we need to put more money into the system. I mean, I hear that over and over and over again over the years. And we've made, in last session we put, I think, over $200 million additional dollars. But what I'm hearing you say in your recommendations is that it's not more money, that we need to change. The biggest problem that we need to fix is our turnover. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. Because it's really hard to judge the impact of new funding when the agency cannot keep their positions filled, and they have about, across the state, they have about a 10% vacancy rate. Mm-hmm. And so it's really difficult to tell what is the impact of more money if they can't use the money that they, or the positions that they've been allocated.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, you're projecting an overall fiscal gain. Is that right? If we make these other changes?
Well, so the agency gave us a number. They said for every caseworker that leaves, we have a $54,000 impact on the agency, mm-hmm. and we calculated that out. So for the number of caseworkers that leave every year, that's about a $72 million impact, mm-hmm. more or less. And so we can't say exactly how much, but if you improve turnover even just a little bit, yeah, that's a
well, and not
impact.
Just, I mean, obviously there's the money aspect of it, but it just makes no sense to keep training new people and having them leave the system, and I don't think it's money. In fact, I think the Stevens report especially has some fascinating information that we'll hear from them that I think just reinforces what we're hearing from your findings. So, well, thank you. No questions?
I have a question.
Oh, well, your light wasn't on. Oh, Senator, I knew you would.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Let me, just one other thing, and then, let things lighten up now. We have, as I said, we've heavily invested in increasing caseworkers over the years with the goal of decreasing caseloads, and we've made huge progress in that area. I think in 2005 we had 5,000 caseworkers. We've got 8,700 today, and caseloads in 2005 were at 43. They're at 20 today. Last session we funded 9,000 caseworkers, and I think that's what the agency requested. I think that was Judge Fisher saying yes. We funded 9,000. We only have 8,700 in place right now. So, you know, from what I understand, we're hiring like crazy, but we can't retain the ones we have like we would like to. And I think clearly we need to push to reach that 9,000 mark, but once we're there, should we put all of our focus into retention as opposed to increasing that overall number? What are your thoughts on that? And what about salary? Are there other things that we can improve besides salary that will help us improve our retention efforts? Just speak on that for just a minute?
Sure. I think the number of positions before you decide to allocate more, I mean, I'm not on the appropriations committee, so I'm not going to say what that number should be, of course, but focusing the agency needs to focus on retention, because
Yes.
really a lot of these problems revolve around their work culture and the management of the workers, and that's what is impacting turnover, and that's what we found in the survey we conducted of staff, in addition to the SAO does employee exit surveys, and pay was actually the third
Yeah.
reason, the third most important reason. It's certainly a factor, but work environment is 33%, and then 15% are supervisory issues. And those two elements combined, the agency has a lot of influence over those things.
Yeah.
As far as salary goes, again, because that's the third most important reason, we didn't, I'm not going to tell you that increasing salary wouldn't help, but just given the work environment that some of these folks are in, and the fact that we found that it's often not supportive and can be punitive, no one wants to work in that environment. So increasing pay wouldn't have as dramatic effect as it might.
Something else changes.
If you, right.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody goes into this business thinking they're going to get rich, but they want to help kids. And one of the things that was most shocking, I don't know if it was in your report or Stephen's, which we'll hear, was they're spending 26% of their time with kids
That was
and families. Okay, that's crazy to me. That's just nuts. Anyway, I look forward to hearing further how we can improve retention, because I think that's where it's at. So thank you for your report. Lights up. Let's see. The first one, Representative Raymond, then, and Senator Uriski, we're so happy to have you, but you have to wait till members finish.
Thank you.
But stick around. I'm sure you will.
I'm not ready.
Representative Raymond.
Well, I feel like yielding to my good friend over there, but I'm not just yet. No, but I wanted to ask you just to elaborate a little bit about the where you said that the surveys were that on the exit interviews that the largest percentage of the reason why they're leaving had to do with work environment. What can you talk a little bit more about that?
That could actually be a number of factors, and we recognize that some of those could be job stress, just emotional stress of the job, things that are inherent to the job, but it can also be the management environment and the way that workers are treated on the job as well.
Well, okay, so I think it's important, is that when you say it that simply, if you will, then is it in fact the stress of the job because of the cases that they're dealing with? How they're treated, does that include with, they're getting after them because their supervisors or somebody else may be concerned that a kid that they're supposed to be taking care of may be in peril or in danger or whatever? I mean, the way you've laid it out, you make it seem like, well, they're leaving because they're treating them they're not treating them very nicely. They're being mean to them.
Well, we think that
they're
that's
scolding them.
partially-
They're getting after them.
We think that's
Why are they
partially
getting
the
after them?
reason.
Huh?
We think that's partially the reason why a lot of them are leaving. And yes, the cases they're working are difficult, and we recognize that the inherent nature of the work is difficult, and that's why some people leave. And this field is always going to have higher turnover than some other fields. But we think that there are things the agency can do, and those are recommendations that we highlight here, just to improve the overall environment to better support workers.
Our surveys and the interviews.
Right, and our survey showed that too. I mean, we got a lot of comments from caseworkers saying, I never expected to get rich doing this job. I like working with kids. I believe in the mission of this agency, but the environment I work in and the management is not supportive, and they don't feel supported by the agency's leadership either.
And so can you give us just some examples, or maybe the judge can, but where they don't feel supported?
Well, to give you an example, something that we talk about in issue 1 is just that there's a perception that supervisors overuse corrective action instead of coaching to improve performance. So if there's a problem, if a caseworker can't meet their numbers, goals, or what have you, supervisors often, and we saw this in several different information sources, the agency's own internal reviews, our survey, and our own interviews with caseworkers as well, is that supervisors often, that's the first thing they go to, is corrective action instead of coaching. So that's an example.
Right.
Senator Schwartner.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. found issue one, and I agree completely with you, Madam Chair, that caseworker turnover and retention is of paramount importance. But it does seem to, at least in reading the report, boil down to the management and supervision of those caseworkers, more so than if you look at their respective case volumes and pay across various geographic regions. There's a wide discrepancy of turnover between the various regions, with an overall state rate of 32%, I believe, for investigations. Right. And if I was Commissioner Specia, I'd have to find out what is the best thing the agency can do to diminish turnover. What is the one or two or three management principles that I can institute? We have 100+ recommendations, I think, for DFPS, and there's a whole lot of different things that could be done, but I'd concentrate on the ones that have the highest potential for the maximum amount of success. Do you, reviewing this agency from top down, have any specific ideas that you think are the highest probability of improving the agency in the shortest amount of time, just from a managerial standpoint?
Well, the issue one recommendations are purely management recommendations, because we thought that the agency needed to start implementing those immediately. So if the Sunset Commission adopts those in August, then the agency would have to immediately start working on those. And so some of the recommendations that we think are things that the agency can do would be using existing caseworker positions as mentors for new workers, because right now they have this influx of new staff because they were allocated new positions last session. But if those staff don't receive the support they need and the coaching and the mentoring and the teaching, they're not going to stay. They're going to get overwhelmed and they're going to leave. And we heard that a lot in the feedback we got in our survey.
So you think early mentoring is very important then?
I think it is, yes.
How about the policies and procedures? I was pretty astounded that they vary by region, I believe, is what I read. Mm-hmm. They're not centralized, and the ones that are centralized is very unwieldy and not actually utilized by agency personnel. Did you figure out why various regions have different policies and procedures for the same agency?
I really don't know where that originated. I think it is. I think it's a long-standing, because I've heard that's been true for a long time. And I think on the state level, we have state level policies and procedures, but I think that the state office just doesn't have a good handle on how that's being implemented in the field. And so that's where our recommendations are going towards, is helping them to simplify so it's easy to tell what the policy is and easy to follow. And so that people aren't relying on their supervisors or other managers to figure out what they should do on a certain case, but they can rely on a written policy.
I find this agency very difficult in the sense that you're really trying to change a culture of an autocratic and kind of dictatorial history of how they supervise their employees. At least that's what I'm reading from the commission. Unfair, unsupportive, bullying, unresponsive, fear-driven were some of the comments of DFPS's own internal management reviews of their staff. And that's a very, very difficult thing for an agency to correct. And I'm very interested in hearing what Commissioner Specia and his administrative team has to say about how they go about changing the culture. Thank you.
Senator Hinojosa.
Just a few brief comments and observations and maybe questions. I've done casework with Child Protective Services, and I get the sense that the quality of the training is really uneven, and also the experience. You have caseworkers out there who really don't know what they're doing. Some do, but a whole bunch of them don't. And it's kind of difficult to talk to them, communicate with them, because they're very defensive when you ask them about some of the actions that they take. It takes leadership to be able to lead people to want to stay and do a very good job. Maybe when they start out, they have good intentions. Somewhere along the way, they lose their enthusiasm, they lose their commitment, and very much discouraged. But to me, it just we're losing I think it's $54,000 for caseworker that leaves. It costs $54,000. I mean, I'd rather pay and get a better quality of applicant, better training, even if it's longer, and not just throw them out there to the wolves, so to speak, and many times making decisions that end up costing lives, and they don't take the correct action when the family is abusive, or complete opposite. They take the child away from a family that is not doing anything abusive at all. I mean, and you have those contradictions in the system. And to me, that's a lack of leadership. There's a lack of competent managers across the whole spectrum. Some are good, some are bad. And I agree with Lieutenant Schwartner, like the whole culture needs to be changed. I mean, the whole mentality that they have. And I really don't know how to do that other than just revamping an agency from top to bottom. Because the problems, as long as I can remember, have continued since the 80s. It's always the same issue. Obviously, there no doubt that the work they have to do is very oppressive, it's a lot of stress, very stressful, a lot of pressure, making life and death decisions in many cases. But for that, you need a certain type of employee, a certain type of worker. I don't want to use the ladder jobs, for example, where you only take a certain type of applicants. If you don't qualify because you don't have the personality, you don't have the background, you don't have the education, then you don't get hired. And here, it is that we're so desperate that we'll take anybody. And then don't give them the proper tools to do the job. And I don't like to use the military as an example, but certainly, there's certain branches of the military take certain type of people who want to be soldiers that have certain commitment that possibly some wouldn't fit in the Marine Corps because they don't have the type of commitment or personality or not can't handle the type of training. Others go to the Air Force. I'm just trying to understand what the problem really is, but I can see the symptoms and the results, and they're not pretty. Anyway, it's an issue, and maybe we all just obviously this agency is very much needed, but we really need to completely come in and redo the whole structure and the way they perform and manage and lead and train their employees and how they hire their employees and what qualifications they require someone applying for this type of job, because it's just not for anybody.
If I could take that as a question.
Yes.
If I may. Because I've been noticing that the questions so far have all been pretty much the same. And it's identifying what the problems are and getting in there and fix it. And the first thing that the chair said was that we've got to get in there and fix it. And that's what we've been saying to the your staff members and such. You've got to get in there and cut it off. You've got to stop the cycle, because it is a cycle. It's been continuing for a long time. I've been involved in it too for a long time. You see a lot of the same things. Our recommendations, along with some of the Stephen group, are designed to do that. They looked more at hiring. So it's the first part that you're talking about. They have recommendations on the hiring process. We have recommendations on once they've started. And while we couldn't really evaluate the length and quality of their training program once they went into the field, we certainly were made well aware that people didn't feel equipped to handle those. Now, the supervisors are supposed to be working with them to help them along as they start getting their own cases and stuff. When the supervisors are handling a huge caseload and two of their people they're supposed to be supervising quit last week and they're taking over their caseload, the supervisor isn't mentoring the new person. The new person's out on their own with no experience. All right, so we're suggesting take some of the empty positions and turn some of the good workers that you have into mentors, and have mentors within there so that you can develop the people post-training so that they become better at the job. And then you have supervisors. Well, those supervisors, a lot of them were just workers, maybe not even the greatest workers, because they didn't get all the training not that long ago, but because the supervisor quit and the supervisor or the supervisors quit. They were promoted up because you need somebody with some experience to be the supervisor. Did they get leadership training? No. You can't have somebody supervise with absolutely no leadership training. You need, well, as Senator Birdwell would probably say, if you don't have really good NCOs, your command is going to be in deep trouble. So, you need leaders at that level, at the supervisor and the next level. They've got to give them leadership training and improve the quality of the supervisors. One of the most common answers, I don't remember, it was number one, on the survey when we asked was the quality of the supervision. They thought the supervisors were terrible. Now, lots of people don't like their boss, but, this was more than that. So you have inexperienced supervisors trying to supervise inexperienced people. We've got to stop it. Yeah. So our recommendations are aimed at, at that. Let's get some mentors in there, get some people staying longer so that 6-month cycle cuts out and spending $54,000 every 6 months. And then for other pieces that we heard, like the corrective, Amy talked about the corrective performance things. People would doing, it's like in high school, I'm going to put a black mark on your, I'm going to put that on your permanent record. Rather than, okay, you messed up, let's figure out how to do that better next time. Well, a good supervisor is going to do that, just in any organization, whatever it is. And you've got to look at the people who are in charge and look at their turnover rate. If everybody leaving under Supervisor X or Supervisor of Supervisor, X's division, then something's wrong in X, and you've got to address it. Our first recommendation in this section is aimed at they have to have people at the management level, from Judge Specia on down, that are looking at turnover and other management performance issues, so they know that Region X is looking like it has a problem, particularly Office Y is having a real problem with turnover, and look at why is that. Some of it could be because they're in Midland and they're all going to work in the shale fields. But, some of it can't be controlled. But where you can control, they need somebody monitoring that and reporting back so that they know where to take action to intercede. Merit pay, we got all kinds of comments. Remember, we got 6,000 responses to our from CPS.
It was almost 7,000 overall.
Overall, 6,000 of them were CPS workers. So we got an extraordinary response to our survey from workers. And when a lot of people are telling you merit pay is based on who's friends with the supervisor that's there, their people are leaving because of that. So their system isn't right. We also heard a lot about the supervisors not doing the performance evaluations, and you're not going to get a pay raise if you don't have a performance evaluation in. So they're stuck if you can't get your supervisor to do their job and do that. So they have a lot of pieces of this that they can intercede on, and I understand from Judge Specia they are very interested in doing a lot of this. And you can ask him what their plan is, but Mr. Stephen and his group that have complementary recommendations here. So I think that even started with answering Mr. Raymond's question. I'm sorry if I went on too long, but everybody was asking sort of the same thing. What can we do now? And that's what we tried to look at, is what can we do now to get this stop the problem and intercede and try to bring those numbers down, knowing that you're always going to have a fair amount of turnover because of issue number one that you talked about in your conversation, Mr. Raymond, which was it's a tough job and some people are going to burn out and not do it. You're always going to have a fair amount of turnover, but let's stop where we can. So that's what we were trying to do with every single one of these points in this issue and a number of the points in the Stephen report.
I think there are tough jobs in a society where you don't have that high of a turnover. So obviously, the techniques and training that can be used to at least minimize that. Thank you for your response.
Dr. Buckingham, you were next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you all tell me, and I'm going to ask Judge Speaker the same thing, just to give you a heads up, what do you think the ideal structure of the operational unit is?
The operational, are you referring to recommendation 1.1?
Yes, just kind of how the social workers and supervisors and the mentors should be organized into a unit.
Oh, in the field. We didn't evaluate that point, so I can't really make a recommendation on the fly. So, but I think that could be a better question.
And
for the
Mr.
agency.
Stephen may be able to.
Yeah, he may have evaluated that as well.
Okay, and then it seems like the main differences, or one of the main differences between your report and the Stevens report was about the mentorship. Can you kind of contrast those for me and tell me which one?
That was one of the only areas where I saw that there was a kind of more of a difference. Everything else seemed to be, their recommendations seemed to line up with ours. It could be implemented together. And they made recommendations in areas we didn't and vice versa. But in that one, we recommended that there be dedicated mentors because the agency is actually, they had dedicated on-the-job trainers up until about 2010, 2011, and then with budget cuts, they cut those positions. One thing we heard from caseworkers, this is where this all came from, is that you need to have dedicated people who are there to help new workers along, like Ken was saying. And what they did after those budget cuts was that they assigned caseworkers who already had caseloads to be mentors. And I think that's the Stephen group, their recommendation would have caseworkers who have caseloads be assigned mentor, to be a mentor. And then the supervisor of that unit would have to take into account that person's workload to make sure they actually had time to be a mentor. But we just thought that it was more efficient just to dedicate people to that purpose because clearly your caseload can end up taking precedence over your mentor responsibilities.
Thank you.
Sure.
Senator Uristi.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Welcome.
Members.
We're glad to, and I know this is an issue you have been involved in and following for a long time, so I'm really happy you're here.
And I just want to make a few comments. I
Sure.
won't take much time from the committee, but I do appreciate you allowing me to be here. And one question I'd like to start off with is if you could qualify the survey that we've been talking about, because I've heard two different things. You sent a survey out, I suppose, to all the current employees, and then there was an exit survey. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are two different things we're talking about. So the first thing that we actually saw before we did our own survey was the state auditor's office does an exit survey of state employees who leave their agencies. So we looked at data that that DFPS provided us of just CPS caseworkers who left, and that's where we got those numbers, about a third leave for work environment, et cetera.
So let me ask real quick on that point then. How many of those that left filled out that survey? Do we have an idea? I mean, was it 5%, 50%?
I actually don't know the percentage.
See, therein, I think, lies part of the problem, because I think the current employees that filled it out, we're going to get a pretty good idea of what's going on with them at this time. But for those that have left, I think the first question that has to be asked is how many of them actually filled it out and bothered to fill out the survey? And those that did fill it out, I think then you get the numbers that you've presented to the committee. Is that correct? Does that make sense? In other words, we don't have any idea of how many people have filled out the survey that have left.
I can either get that data for you or the agency may actually know.
So I think when we talk then about the different priorities or the reasons they left, I don't know that we're getting a true feel for the reasons that they left. Whether it was, I'm not saying it wasn't culture, I know that's a big part of it, but if pay truly is the third, ranks number 3 is the reason why they left.
Well, I would say that the survey that we did, where we got the nearly 6,000 responses from CPS workers, we found a lot of the same issues. People did talk about pay being a concern in caseloads, but much more often they talked about work environment issues that are within the agency's control. So I think that the SAO exit survey data, that lines up with what we heard from current workers.
Okay, so I just wanted to kind of clarify on that. And I do agree with you, Madam Chair, that obviously turnover is a huge problem. But I don't think there's a single shot answer to this issue. I mean, I think it's more of a shotgun approach, if you will, but strategic nonetheless. I think, and I'm talking to of course, to the agency, but I think we need to be strategic in our approach along the lines that we've talked about over the the many years that we've been working on this issue. So I think it's a mistake if the legislature comes back and says, okay, we're going to target just turnover, which is a huge problem. But I also heard you say, I think it was number 6, that prevention efforts need to be bolstered, whatever that means. But I do think there's a dollar amount associated with that. And I know it's not just about throwing more money after this problem, but if you're efficient about it, then we can be more effective. And when we spend 3 to 5% of our total budget on DFPS on prevention, we will never change these problems. I mean, just not. We're not. But more importantly, the other cost that we ought to be thinking about is the cost to these children. When you have 66,000 kids, confirmed cases of abuse and neglect in Texas every year, there's a cost to those children. And I think as we look at this bigger picture, we step back and we look at this bigger picture, we have to keep that in mind. And it can't just be dollars and cents on a piece of paper, in our budget that we're trying to keep tight. We all have a budget to live within. But I think we have to keep those 66,000 kids every year in Texas that are abused and neglected. And those are confirmed cases. Think about the cases that aren't confirmed. We just couldn't quite put our finger on it. So that's all I wanted to say, Madam Chair. I appreciate the time, and I look forward to working with you and the rest of the members and the agency this next session. And thank you all for your work.
And Senator Urisi, I agree. There is no silver bullet solution. Another issue that came up that I think was reflected in the report even, and Senator Specia, Judge Specia has brought this up, the data that we have access to, the impact system, and having that so we can effectively manage that, I think is important as well. I know the report touched a little bit on that. Any comments on what we can do in that area to improve?
Well, what we recommended there was that because the agency has so many potential changes that could be happening both through the sunset process as well as the operational assessment, that they needed to line that up with the changes they're making to the impact system, because it's going to be happening simultaneously. And if the agency doesn't do a good enough job of planning and deciding, okay, what do we need and what do caseworkers need to do the job more efficiently, and also collect the data we need. Those are two components. Then it's not going to work as well. And we also touched on the data issues in several of our recommendations, just recommending that they do a better job of identifying what's really important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that at other hearings, that, it's important to use that, have good data, but then use that data to help us solve our problem, or don't do it,
Yeah.
I don't need all this data.
They have a lot of data. It's just a question of how to use it.
Using it effectively, I agree. Representative Dutton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It seems to me that maybe 2 or 3 sessions ago, the legislature was trying to get this agency, CPS at least, to look to placements within families as opposed to outside the family. Did you all get into any taking a look to see whether that's being accomplished or not?
Actually, the agency is now required through statute, for what you're talking about, to look for relative placements first. And that number has increased quite a bit. I think I have some data on that. It's gone up.
It has, okay. Right. And I would have fully expected it to, because there was...
So the data I have says for children who can't go home who cannot return safely home, about 64% of those kids exit to a relative, either through adoption or through another arrangement.
Well, that's a positive then, because that was 64%. Over what time period is that?
That was since 2003.
Okay.
So and it was 49% at that time.
That's right. Okay. Right.
And it's 64%.
That makes sense. The other thing that Senator Uresti reminded me of is when I started examining the 60,000 kids who are suffering some abuse and neglect, one of the things I was told, and I'm not sure that's correct, but that the agency has the definition for abuse and neglect was rather fluid, I mean, there's nothing that workers have that acts as a guidepost to them when making these judgments about abuse and neglect. Is that
Well,
fair?
there's a statutory definition, which
Right.
I don't have in front of me, but the agency
Right.
could elaborate on that. And they do have, I'm sure that there's some policy that talks about that and how to judge that, but I think it could end up being subjective, but I don't really know the details
You
of,
don't? Okay.
of
All right. I
what,
just
what
wondered.
guidance they're given.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
You bet. Senator Schwartz?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I was just listening to my friend Senator Resti's comments, and it is multifactorial, obviously, and a shotgun approach is probably warranted. Between workforce environment, and supervision, and pay, those seem to be the three driving factors according to at least the surveys and individuals that spoke up about it. But this last session, I'd like to point out, as Madam Chair did earlier, that we as a state put an extra $346 million toward hiring caseworkers for DFPS. After I highlighted that, I wrote down, how was this money spent? And we tried to, I think we increased our caseworker volume by over 600 places, but yet not all of those are filled, obviously. So it's more than just the money. It's how that money is spent within the agency, as well as the workforce environment and the supervision of those. And speaking of the supervision, there are 11 different regions with high turnover differentials between those various regions. Can you speak to the various regions and what your thoughts are there? There have been significant turnover in the administration at the regional level of the agency?
I don't know the answer to that, but I will say that, so there are some regions, like in West Texas, like Ken was talking about, where
Because of the
if there are
oil
economic
and gas.
factors that influence the turnover rate quite a bit. But we weren't able to explain necessarily the differentials in other regions, and we thought that the agency really needs to have a better handle on those different turnover rates and where it's most critical. Because when you have such differentials in the same region, which is what we saw, even down to the unit level, if you have over 100% turnover in a single unit, but the overall regional turnover is, say, 30%, you know that something's probably wrong in that unit. So that's what we're trying to get the agency to do, is look at that more and be more proactive about it.
You say something is wrong, but also you note in the report that you authored that the national turnover rate for CPS is between 30 and 40% in all the states. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's the source that we found.
Well, we're on par in that respect. It's not great, but it's very unfortunate. What can Texas do to be better than par? Have you looked at the best states and their best practices, or?
Well, I will say that based on some of the audits and evaluations that we've seen come out since we started this review and some of the things that we reviewed from the recent past, it seems that most states struggle with this function quite a bit, and turnover is an issue everywhere. But we do think that some of the recommendations we made in issue 1 that are directed at culture
Right.
can help improve the numbers.
Culture and leadership, supervision, support of the employee.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Well, yeah, who's that down there?
One.
Representative Simmons.
Yes. In my reading of your report, in my reading of your report, and that's why I want you to tell me if I'm wrong or not. I read that you have some significant concerns about DFPS and the management of it and how everything's working. Is that correct?
That would be a good characterization.
Okay. So, but under issue 1 and issue 6, you're recommending that we transfer some functions from other agencies under HHS to DFPS. Would we seriously want to do that, even one function, until we are confident that the overall management scenario is like we want to see it?
Well, in reference to issue 6, our evaluation there focused on whether those programs at HHSC and DSHS, whether they fit with the prevention, with the mission of the agency.
I understand that, and I understand ultimately that might be where it's going to be, but would you want to move that over there today?
Well, we need to adopt y'all need to adopt the other recommendations in issue 6 to improve their planning and their targeting of resources.
Would you want to see that happening before you decided to move? Wouldn't you want to see some results before you said, let's make a move, or would you say, let's just go for it?
I think that's all for you to decide, but that's
Okay.
just our
I
judgment.
just want to know what you're recommending.
Right, what we're recommending is overall that the prevention focus of the agency be elevated and that they put more emphasis on it.
Agreed.
And then we need to have programs at the agency from these other agencies that actually serve a lot of the families that
Yep.
this agency serves. And so it's really a whole package.
But we have to know that they can handle what they're doing now before we add something else. That would be what I would normally
I think that's a fair question, but that's kind of we went in the other direction and thought
Okay.
that
All
it
right.
should be.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you, ma'am.
Representative Burkett?
Yeah, on the mentorship program you were talking about earlier, the current one in place, you said that they also handle a caseload. Is that a full caseload like the caseworkers do?
I believe so.
Is there one at all now?
Well, it's a little more informal, so they don't have dedicated positions, but they have sort of some caseworkers can be mentors, and I'm not sure exactly how that works now. But I think that they carry full caseloads, but the agency can confirm that for you.
Do you have any idea what that percentage is of the current ones, or is that an agency question as well?
I think so, because I don't have that for you.
Because I'm just trying to determine, of course, we always want to be careful how we designate money, but if it's going to be more logical and get a better outcome to designate a mentor as that's their position, maybe we need to shift that around. But then I guess the other question was, along with that, with the mentors, do we have specific performance measurements that the mentors give to the case workers so that they're confident in what they're looking to achieve? Or is it just a matter of driving by and checking to make sure the child is out of immediate danger? But do they have some kind of measurement to know what they're trying to achieve to maybe get the child back with their families, or if that's not possible, to get them permanently placed somewhere?
Well, we didn't contemplate what a performance measure would be for a mentor, but that's something that could be elaborated upon, I think. The Stephen Group may have some ideas on that, but we could, and the agency may have ideas on that as well. So,
Okay, thank you.
but we didn't contemplate that in our recommendation.
Thank you very much.
Senator Schwartner?
Thanks, Madam Chair. The budget of DFPS is 85% CPS, and APS is thrown in there as well. It seems to be a smaller focus of DFPS. Are there caseworkers, or are they siloed, APS only, CPS only, within the agency?
Well, they're separate workers, and so they
Completely separate workers,
But
no overlap at all?
they're often co-located in the same offices.
Right.
They
I
just
just-
don't serve the same clients.
I just wonder if APS is the best, if DFPS is the best place for APS, considering that all the functions of DFPS center around children and child care, whereas
That was something
APS
that we contemplated, but it's really a structural issue that's best left for the overall system
Right,
review of AHHS.
if you have a more specific focus, and it just crossed my mind. This was wanting to
fair
know whether or not APS had any overlap at all with CPS. It does not.
They do. They perform a lot of the same work. They're working to protect people.
Right.
It's just that
But they don't share cases or
no.
okay, thank you.
Other questions of the agency? No? Thank you. You've heard mention, members, several times now of the Stephen Group that was an outside consulting firm hired by DFPS to conduct an extensive operational review of Child Protective Services, that began several months ago. Last week, the Stevens Group issued a report with several recommendations that closely related to the issues that we're discussing within Sunset. So I asked them to come present to us today a brief, and underscore the word brief, summary of their findings. I'd like to call them up now before we bring up the agency so that the agency has the opportunity to respond to both sets of recommendations during their testimony. And I was just amazed at how closely aligned this Stevens report was to our Sunset findings. So the chair will now call John Stephen, managing partner of the Stephen Group, and anybody else you want to bring up with you. You should have done Yeah, you should have gotten one. If you didn't, we'll get you another one.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, identify yourself for the record, and I just
I
want
will.
to tell you heads up, good reading. It was just
Well-
fascinating to me how closely you followed what Sunset recommendations were.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is John Stephen, Managing Partner for the Stephen Group, and with me at the table is Martha Tuttle, one of our senior consultants at the Stephen Group, who was instrumental in working on this assessment. For the record, we were retained by HHSC and DFPS after a competitive bid on an operational assessment of the CPS program. I want to say for the record that this assessment was called for by both Commissioner Janik and Commissioner Specia so that they could look at the agency because of probably, Madam Chair, I know you, especially in being very involved, and many of you here, in giving funds over the years and really trying to see that this agency go forward in the positive direction. They wanted an independent review to make sure that the agency was working at it at its best and fullest extent. So we were hired and contracted with them, and after the review, or during the review, I just want to let you know how comprehensive it was. We first were asked to do what's called an as-is current assessment, so assessing the operations. Most of it's operational. It is looking at the CPS workers at those 3 stages of service to identify all issues involving their current state of operations. That was in every region. We had focus groups in every region. We wouldn't allow supervisors in our focus groups. We had 2 to 3 days sometimes with them in Arlington, Houston, other areas of the state. We're probably the only consulting group that has actually gone in and physically gone to every single region during an assessment. We also did ride-alongs. I've done a ride-along. Martha has done a ride-along. We interviewed senior workers. My staff come from all different states. We hire senior level staff that have served as either commissioners, directors in states. We have experience from Florida, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and recently doing the transformation of child welfare in Florida. Martha is still working with Florida, and we helped them start their process a couple years ago. A lot of similarities, and we have that general experience. As part of the assessment, we also were able to look at internally at the state office and identify an interview. And one thing I will say from the beginning, that CPS was, especially Commissioner Specia, was as transparent as any state we have worked in. We've worked in a number of states. In fact, had us meet on a number of occasions with legislative staff and allowed us to review all the data, and we had security agreements we signed that was available in the data warehouse, and we have some folks that are very sophisticated in analyzing data. We didn't want to just use the data that they gave us with their interpretation. We analyzed it ourselves and found some interesting issues. We also were able to look at the big picture perspective, and our fundamental takeaway is that this agency that has so many, in our opinion, and we have all been in there, I've actually managed and overseen a child welfare agency, has many talented people. And I want to say that right from the beginning. Our full staff felt strongly that the strengths, in fact, in our assessment report, we wanted to highlight up front the strengths that they bring to the state of Texas, in our opinion, are enormous. They are enormously talented. They have a lot of great assets. But there is consistent change, and there are a number of problems that they're seeing at the level where they just cannot do their job. They are social workers. They were hired to be social workers. And there are a number of competing strategies, and we can talk about that. And I want to be very brief here. But to put the real-life figures on what we saw, we did do, Senator, a survey. Our survey asked the workers, 3,000 responded within the first week. We haven't seen that high response rate in any of our states, 3,000. And we asked them, why do you think people leave at such a high rate? Supervision, workload, salary. We were surprised we didn't hear a lot about salary in the focus groups. We heard a lot about supervision. We heard a lot about workload, and we can talk about that as well. Our survey found that 26% of the time they were visiting and being with families at all stages of service. 26% of the time. We felt that was very important to highlight. And the real important thing about that is this wasn't a scientifically validated assessment. I want to be clear here. It was ours, but it was 3,000 employees. And we took that and we put that into, okay, average time driving, average time working on paperwork, average time in the office, average time doing these staffings with supervisors. And then in every one of our focus groups, we asked the line workers, you tell us what you think it is. And they validated that number throughout. So we used that as our benchmark. And the other thing is we saw the turnover in analyzing the data was enormously high. Now in Florida, when we worked in Florida, we saw high turnover. When I was a commissioner, I saw high turnover. This is not unusual. What is so unusual in this state is the high turnover at the investigator level and in those stages of service. So when you ask in the future about turnover, our point in our report was to ask the question about the direct service delivery worker turnovers. Because when you start really looking at the regions and digging into the level of turnover, it gets high at that front line. And that's not a good thing for the state. And you're spending a lot of dollars training and getting that frontline worker up to speed. So that's obviously a big issue. So key highlight in the short time I have here with our assessment, obviously 400 and so odd pages assessment, 200-page recommendations, a lot of things going on here. We really like the Sunset Report. In fact, if the Sunset Report was written before our assessment findings, you probably would accuse me of plagiarism.
I just asked my staff if you communicated with Sunset because they were so similar.
They did a great job, in my opinion, and our full team felt that way. And we were very experienced in having audits and agencies in the past. I think you should be proud of their work. And I know that both commissioners are as well, which again is really, really good for this state to have two commissioners that really want to make a difference. So to sum up our review, I think there needs to be a clear vision within CPS of the future, which will result in a more efficient, focused, and streamlined quality operation that will prove beneficial to families, children, staff, and provide stakeholders like this body with the confidence that CPS is doing all it can to protect the safety, well-being, and permanency of children in Texas. Fundamentally, our findings and our recommendations all lead back to one well-defined message. Get CPS focused on a small number of clear goals that will lead to higher quality, greater efficiency, better performance, and everyone will be pulling the same rope in the same direction. We are excited to discuss our aspects or any aspect of our assessment and our findings with you. We stand committed to help you in any way we can, and I believe strongly that I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. You have the talent in that agency to really make this work. In our opinion, and it is not about money. It's about culture, and it's about people. And you can make a difference by really helping that agency by sometimes stepping back, but really overseeing, but let them do the great work that I think that they're capable of doing. Be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you for your report, and yeah, I think it so complements the work that the Sunset Commission, Sunset Report focuses on and hits on the same major issues. If anything, they kind of validate each other, I think. And I think, certainly myself, I think we all who have been here should accept a little of the blame, if it's blame, but this is an area we care so passionately about. In every session we have, how many times, Senator Aristi, have we had CPS reform? Every session. And we keep trying to fix the problem. We keep adding it on and adding on, and I think that may be part of the problem, if I'm reading this all right. So, and it's just fascinating to me to know that these just frontline workers are only spending 26% of their time doing what they got into this field for. That's got to change, because these are people. That's like having a teacher just spend 26% of her time teaching children. That's just wrong. I guess my bottom line question is this: you are suggesting that we kind of press the pause button and focus on just a few things. However, your report alone has 160 recommendations. And so how do we reconcile the fact that both you and Sunset are telling us that CPS has to take a time out and do a few things right, but we've got 160 recommendations?
Well, that's a great question, Senator. We internally, before we finalized the recommendations as a team, had that similar discussion. And we all had so many great ideas that I thought it was important that we at least highlight them, so that in the future, the agency could benefit down the road from our own thinking and assessment and findings. We conducted, since February, we were in every region. We spent detailed time. We really felt that the recommendations were important to be outlined. But we said from the very beginning, we never expected CPS to implement all of those recommendations. So when we said, for example, that they should be working on something that could be completed in near term, we wanted to leave it up to the agency to develop the prioritization that they need to develop to really make that roadmap happen. The very first recommendation we had was the timeout, the pause. I can tell you today, from speaking with the folks at CPS yesterday, meeting with them, that they're already asking the RDs for that list. They're working diligently to get the list of these issues that could be stopped. And I guess we gave them a suggestion on criteria. When it comes down to it, all of that has to be looked at, including our recommendations. What are the most critical things that need to be done now to move this agency in the right direction without interrupting the work that they need to do at the ground level to protect the children and families. And a lot can be done. And for example, today, we were looking at, we mentioned in our report, 18 to 30-month workers. You need to find a way to go and get in front of them immediately and say, what can I do to buy another year or a couple years, or get them excited about the next few years. Now, does that take a lot of effort, time, money? At the end of the day, come up with whatever they're going to do. Come up with your plan. Get in front of those people right now, because our data review shows that usually about 25% are leaving after 1 year. But then after the second year, 50% of the workforce gone after 2 years. So there's a lot of recommendations here, but once the department determines the prioritization, and I think what they said earlier, the Sunset was recommending for them to come back and show you. You can ask them what they prioritized, but that was the thinking, Senator.
Thank you. It's just fascinating to me. Representative Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think a tremendous amount of attention has been given to the fact that since your report came out, that caseworkers are spending 26% of their time with families, and that's drawn a lot of attention to that issue. But one of your findings that I don't think has received a lot of attention, but maybe one of the more critical findings, was that there's no common practice model in Texas for standardizing and implementing best practices. So if that's the case, can things be done to improve many of these recommendations that you cite without a common best practices model? Should that be one of the priorities?
Absolutely, Senator.
You're giving me a promotion. I'm
representative. Representative.
I have to defer to the chair.
Wise man that he is.
Well, you are wise, because that
or at least a bigger budget.
Fundamentally, that has to come first, and you really are correct. The agency has been working for a while on adopting a practice model. We think that should be top priority, and they do recognize that. And I think that you'll hear in the next few weeks or months ahead that that'll be one of the areas that they'll probably be rolling out to the staff in the front line.
In a general sense, how long would that take?
Well, it's taken them a few years to develop the thinking where they are today. Some states, Senator, Representative, it has taken a while. It has taken 3-4 years for some states. Once it's adopted, and practice and policy are different, And if you're following structured, standardized practice that really helps those caseworkers, it's also going to reflect on retention and other issues. So it's really important they get it. And I know at the highest leadership level, they're working on that. So I'm sure you're going to hear more about it.
So it seems, that addresses the retention issue. Besides
Yes.
good service delivery, it also addresses, the work environment and predictability.
And it also, Representative, addresses the assessment, which I don't know if there'll be any questions on the assessment, but I can tell you that one of the things Commissioner Janik said in the very first meeting we had with him, because he used his physician experience and an analogy with us that meant a lot to our staff, because we heard that, and when we went, he was concerned because there was, in that first 24 hours, there's really the safety assessment. How are they assessing safety? I want to make sure these children are safe, and as a commissioner, I understand why he feels that way. And so we started to ask questions. Well, the safety instrument they have today, the assessment, which is not part of their practice model, will dictate what those instruments and assessments are like in the future. They don't assess, they assess safety right away, but they don't fill out their safety assessment till 7 days into the process. So they wait 7 days. We are recommending within 24 hours that you identify and do a structured safety assessment that can be put into the system, could continue along the life of the case in the impact system. And when that 7 days comes, in that 24 days on risk as well. And when the FBSS worker on another stage of service gets the case, they don't have to go and re-enter everything. That they know what that initial assessment was. But that 24-hour period is so critical nationally in child welfare. And this will really help those caseworkers make that decision. It won't all be objective, because that safety instrument should give them an objective assessment, but then you can keep the critical thinking at maybe 20% and 80% objective. But at the end of the day, they're making a decision based upon structured, scientifically based questions and results. And that's what Commissioner Janik wanted in the beginning, and we saw that in the field and validated it.
So I guess focusing on that and developing that model will address, well, I won't call it the first issue, but the issue that gets a lot of attention, which is the amount of time that caseworkers are able to spend right now. So doing one will help with the other, as well as retention, two of the biggest problems.
They're all connected.
Yeah. In other states, you mentioned other states, what are, and obviously we have to prioritize here, but what are you seeing, or what can you give by way of advice in terms of prioritizing some of these recommendations, which will have the greatest return? What's been the most advantageous in other states that they could implement here?
Well, this is a good question. In Florida, we can use that recent experience with, I think, turnover is something they have to get their hand on right away. And this has been going on for years in Texas. We've read all the reports. It costs the agency, if a new worker is $32,000 salary, and then you add the supervision costs and you add some of the other costs, and let's say it costs $50,000 for the first year, and that worker is leaving, 50% leave after 2 years, but 25% leave after that first year, and you spent $50,000, then you ask the question, well, what do you get for that $50,000? And they're only really, by the time they get out of training, they're only handling a couple cases a month in the beginning. And it's costly. So you've got to get a handle on the turnover, because it's costing you so much money, and it's affecting morale because the other workers are also taking on more and more cases because of it. When it all comes down to it, the caseworkers are getting on average with intake about 8 or 9 cases are coming in a month on intake. But because of all the turnover, their caseloads are high because they have to take on all the work of the folks that are leaving. And once you get a handle on turnover, you're gonna help the caseworkers with caseloads that are gonna be normalized. You're gonna make people are gonna feel better. But don't get the impression that turnover isn't a problem in CPS nationally. It is. It's just that here, it's very high on that direct care staff level. So if you start, in some of the key things, the mentorship program that was mentioned. So mentorship, I was listening to one of the questions. I think the doctor may have asked the question about what are the key areas or the key things for turnover. Mentorship. I would say the training, BSD, their training, change that, start immediately. It shouldn't be just stage 1, 6 weeks, the next stage 7 weeks. 13 weeks, they go into on-the-job training on the second week, and the investigators we spoke to, and even CBS, FPSS, some of them are just sitting in an office waiting for someone to come to them to tell them what to do. They're not out there doing cases, really doing, working on cases. What we would like to see is, in what other states have been successful at, is a real mentorship, apprenticeship, on-the-job type training throughout. And that BSD training curriculum change from, like we said, it shouldn't be just that first 7 weeks and then 6. It should be 6-month period, but that you're constantly out in the field, you're being monitored and evaluated, you're coming back, and you've got a mentor, and then you've got to do something for the mentorship. Because if you're going to have someone as a mentor in most states that have mentors, their apprenticeship type program, it's almost like it's a pay grade up before you become a supervisor, or it's a promotion. But it's a worker who's really someone you look up to, and it's your buddy. It's like the buddy system. And once that we heard a number of times, we'd ask, why did you stay at CPS? It was because of my supervisor. If you could start, now the mentor and the supervisor though are different in our recommendation. The supervision is different. But a mentorship has to happen, in our opinion, if you want to really get a handle on that. The other issue is the hiring program they have through the vendor Stark. CPS uses Stark. They determine the candidates. They send it over to Stark. Stark is their HR vendor. Stark goes through their profile test, and they also do the self-assessment. They have a test that the individuals take. Once they do the test, there's a scoring. They send them back to CPS. CPS looks at them, decides which ones they want to actually send back for the final review, and then they go back. I think it's Dad's agency uses Stark to do the selection process. CPS doesn't. Now it's a different worker. It's a little more intensive, but you've got to do something to start looking at the recruitment policies and how you find and where you look to get the best for CPS in the future. And I think CPS is already starting to think about that, but they're the only agency in the state that does that with Stark. Now there's so many handoffs. These 2 handoffs alone, it's about 120 days on average for hiring. You think about it, you got to bring someone in, and you're going to wait 120 days. And what we said in here is to you go into FBI. I'm not saying it's like FBI, but you've got to go through the testing, and you're waiting a year before you get selected. But maybe they can devise a program where they actually have good quality people ready to go. And I started off as a prosecutor, and I wanted that job, and I worked hard at it. But I didn't get the job. I passed all the tests. I had to wait for the next guy to leave. And there is a way that can work, so that they have a good force ready to go. And the agency, I think, is thinking in that direction as well. So those are the key issues, I think. If you could really get a handle on turnover, and it's not going to happen quickly, but it can happen. And once you get that turnover down, the amount of dollars you're going to save, and the time and the resources, and you talk about time with families, that's why it's all connected. Martha?
One of the other recommendations that would be a high priority while we're getting turnover under control is to give the regions more flexibility to use the workforce in the way that they need to use it. So what are we talking about there? The stages of service. So right now, we talked earlier about what is that ideal model, and there is a very prescriptive how many investigators are we going to have, how many supervisors to the ratio of investigators, the same for FBSS, kinship workers, etc. That allows for a great deal of transparency so that all the stakeholders know how CPS is using that workforce. The challenge with that model is that when you get into a bind, you can't move people around very easily. So if I have a high turnover in my investigators, I can't borrow somebody from FBSS or CBS very easily to then make them an investigator, to give me a little bit of extra help while I've got an urgent problem. So just the whole idea that we get a benefit from having the transparency and the clarity of workers and the deep skill set from being a specialist in the stage of service. There is more specialization here in Texas than there is in an awful lot of other states. And one of the unintended consequences is that you lose a little bit of that flexibility to handle the ad hoc crisis.
I appreciate your answers. Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Where does the impact system fall into all this? I mean, we invested a lot of money last session, and it is an archaic system. I think it's 17 years old, and I'm convinced from many conversations with Judge Specia that it is important to have a modernized system in order to help our case workers do their job properly. But, in priority order, that's a chunk of change, and we need to put another chunk of change in. And I just would love your perspective on where in all this you would prioritize getting our case management system where it should be.
We prioritize it very high, and yes, it's expensive, and there's no getting around it. The challenge that we have is impact is 6 million lines of code, and if that were equivalent to a line in a book, that would be 400 books on the wall that we've got to constantly keep edited and up to date, and we're translating that from Shakespeare's English to today's modern English so that a new person can actually read that, come up to speed, and figure out how to make a change quickly. So we support the effort that has gone into what's called modernization of impact. We think it's very necessary. Unfortunately, we don't think it's going to be sufficient to necessarily fix all the problems the frontline workers have. When you actually sit down with a worker and walk through something as simple as putting in the address of the 3 children associated with the case they're working on right now, and it's step 1 to bring up the address field, step 2 to enter it and validate it, step 3 to post it, and then you got to go do the same process for every other child in the case. Today's young workers, and that's a lot of what we're hiring, expect that to be as simple as ordering on Amazon. And they expect the one little button where the ship to and the billing address are the same, and I just have one little check mark and boom, it's done. And so it is contributing to that frustration of that worker. It's elongating that learning curve, and when you've got a lot of new workers, that's not the situation you want. So while it's not glamorous to be rewriting how you put in an address, unfortunately there are an awful lot of those changes that are necessary.
Thank you. Let's see, Representative Burkett, you were next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back to your comment, okay, you mentioned that 26% of the time the caseworkers are all that's spent with families. You said there's no common practice model through the state, so why only 26% of the time? My first assumption was that the other percentage of their time was used with paperwork, process, or something. Can you speak to that, what the other percentage of their time was used with?
I have that right here. The working on a tablet or their computer, they spend 24% of the time. Working with paper documentation, 11%. Traveling, 21%. Meetings and others, 18%.
So almost 50% of the time's on tablet or paper? Did I get that?
Pretty close.
Is that filling out paperwork?
A lot of documentation.
Okay, so that you think the common practice model would cut that down? I'm just trying to figure out how you can
I think you could, there's a lot of areas that they can cut down documentation. Impact improvements will help. But yeah, that's something the department's going to absolutely be looking at to try to save time with families. And I would go one step further, that we have recommended that they adopt a metric, that as a metric, so that you can actually measure. It's going to take some time to figure out exactly how they want to do this, but they should. And so you could see where there's been improvements and have those particular practices under the practice model that they've adopted actually giving them more time with families.
So if the common practice model improves that, part of that, from what I was understanding, was some kind of mentor as a classified job versus, and I'd asked this question before, but as a classified job on its own versus combining that duty with casework? Would that be more effective? Do you
No.
think? No.
No, we believe strongly that a mentor has to have a set number of cases and be a caseworker that they can look up to, who's been there for some time and is well experienced, and make the mentorship something that people thrive and want to get to, but not. If I want to be a supervisor someday, I got to be a mentor first, or something of that nature. So you move up.
And still in conjunction with your casework.
Correct.
And then what would that ratio be? What would you anticipate that ratio would be?
Well, one of the things that we wanted to look at was we believe humans are best when they can have a mentor who is in the same location. So rather than having some small number of mentors that had to cover the state and do it virtually, you'd love to, for the first time you had to go out and appear in court, or the first time you were going out to interview a difficult family situation, that's when you want to grab your buddy and say, come help me. You know, I need you to walk me through this situation. So we felt that the physical proximity was very important to have that. We did recognize that you've either got to give that caseworker who's going to be a mentor some extra something, an extra pat on the back, a little bit of relief from their casework, something in order to do it. So we had looked at the whole cost of if you could relieve some of their casework, but yet you had an impact on turnover, can you get that program into some sort of equilibrium? And we think over time you can.
Yeah.
How fast can you get there? Still some details to be worked out.
I guess my observation would be I'd be concerned about burnout on the mentor level. And there you've got your experience, yeah.
Right.
And you don't want that to bleed down. If they're getting burned out and start getting negative or tired or distressed, that might bleed down to who they're mentoring. So it's a fine balance.
It is.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Schwartner. He's gone. He's been so patient. Dr. Buckingham. Oh, let me welcome Senator Nichols. I hear you've been busy over there in transportation, but we welcome you to this committee as well.
We figured out how to fix it. We just need the votes.
I get it. Dr. Buckingham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was so excited to hear you talk about the operational unit and that there is kind of an ideal of what that is. And can you elaborate on that for me, please?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Martha may have something to add to that. But I think right now, the stages of service, if you look at investigation, FBSS, and CVS, it's hard to say the numbers because it all is dependent upon the population, the area, the region. But those three basic stages of service are in place today. And the supervisor to worker ratios here in Texas are not that high. I mean, 7.5, we found about 7.5 to 1 supervisor to worker. Now, some states are lower, and the child welfare standards, I think, are a little lower, but other states, you're right where I think Florida is, you're where a number of other states. So you've got a I think, supervisor ratio that works. What we tried to do, and it goes back to our organizational changes as well, we think your FBSS and your investigation ought to be working together closely, or closer. We observed in the communities that those handoffs sometimes are difficult, Doctor. Some of the FBSS workers are not taking some of the investigation cases, and there's an argument at times, there's a difficult issue. When you have a supervisor that supervises both investigators and FBSS, it all seems seamless, and a lot of the difficulties of those passing cases go away. So we were in Beaumont, and in Beaumont area, and I believe in Lubbock, where they had supervisors that did investigation and FBSS, and we saw a lower turnover in that area. We heard a lot about supervisor morale was up in that unit we met with. Now, this was only a unit in 2 areas. Then we looked at a study that CPS had done, reviewed, that actually had a lower turnover with a dual supervisor role like that. The CVS is a little different. So having a separate supervisor in that unit for CVS is okay, and then they have their program, administrator, or program supervisor beyond the supervisor. What I would say is, when you look at the units, if you could do that, so we said in our organizational changes here in state office, they have a different division for FBSS, and they have a different division for investigation. And most states, those divisions are combined. Those activities are seamless, they're integrated. And we feel strongly that that would be a really good model for them, and we recommended that. So, and then the final thing is, I guess this is probably the most important thing, is that the unit needs flexibility within its budget. So you may have all of a sudden a turnover on a CVS side, and there may be a problem there, but investigators, you don't have a problem. And I want to take an investigative worker and fill in a CVS spot to help us over here in a unit for the time being. Today, that doesn't happen. And there may be budget constraints that we, did not look at completely statutorily or budget regulations, but it just doesn't seem like it's the best system. So if they have flexibility, we feel strongly that that could help. So does that help you with?
Thank you.
The one area that we did focus a lot on was we felt that unit that John talked about is basically okay. But if you look at the regional structure, we looked at the number of specialist positions that are at the region and whether there is appropriate coverage. You've got a big territory to cover. And so how much were the frontline workers able to really tap into those niche specialists where there were maybe only a handful of those people per region or across the state? And is that really giving you the impact that you need from those really super specialists? And what we were looking at is how do we get that knowledge down to that newer worker? If we are going to have a lot of new workers, because we're not going to take turnover to zero. It doesn't happen in this area of child welfare. So if you're always going to have some new workers, how do I commingle and how do I do that sort of Vulcan mind transfer of knowledge from my really great specialists who have a lot of deep expertise to my newer worker? What's the best way to knowledge share?
Any other questions of the Stevens Group? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great work, and I think it's so interesting that it was so well meshed with our Sunset report. All right, we'll hear from the agency now.
I think the seat's
Commissioner, welcome back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, I'm Kyle Janik, the Executive Commissioner of Health and Human Services. The time is late, and I'm going to keep the oratory to a minimum, but let me just say this. There are lots of times around this building when people can question whether something that you do or whatever is a necessary function of government. Nobody disagrees. This is a necessary function of government. I am happy to answer questions, and we will both talk about APS, child care licensing. We will not take our eye off those important missions as well, but we understand a lot of the discussions generated around CPS. I instigated this outside view because I referred to it at the